Welcome. My name is Christopher Paisley. I'm a Philadelphia public school teacher for my YouTube channel, Inside White Fragility. Today I'd like to talk about Facebook's woke assault on whiteness. Facebook is readjusting its algorithms to police anti-black hate speech more aggressively than anti-white hate speech. According to an article in USA Today, Facebook bans hate speech based on race, gender, and other characteristics. It relies on a set of rules called community standards to guide decisions about what violates that ban. The standards are enforced by computer algorithms and human moderators. According to Facebook's hate speech policy, derogatory statements about men and white people are treated the same as anti-Semitic statements or racial epithets. For years, civil rights activists have lobbied Facebook to change its policy of protecting all groups equally. And protecting all groups equally, judging whites and people of color by the same standards, is definitely a big no-no in contemporary American woke culture. Take, for example, the Associated Press's new rules for capitalizing the word black in its news stories, but not the word white. AP's style is now to capitalize black in a racial, ethnic, or cultural sense, conveying an essential and shared sense of history, identity, and community among people who identify as black, the AP writes. AP style will continue to lowercase the term white in racial, ethnic, and cultural senses. And why don't white people deserve to have their race capitalized? After a review and period of consultation, we found at this time less support for capitalizing white, the AP states. We agree that white people's skin color plays into systemic inequalities and injustices, and we want our journalism to robustly explore those problems. But capitalizing the term white, as is done by white supremacists, risks subtly conveying legitimacy to such beliefs. So when you capitalize black, it's social justice, and when you capitalize white, it's racism and white supremacy. The idea that so-called whiteness and white culture must be disrupted and dismantled is steadily gaining ground in a society infiltrated by wokeness. In March of 2019, the Paris Review published an article by black college professor Vinetta Blackburn titled, "White People Must Save Themselves from Whiteness," which stated that white people suffer from cognitive dissonance and profit off of gruesome human suffering while remaining happy. In June of this year, black education activist Nalia Weber, the executive director of the Orleans Public Education Network, published an article in the Education Post titled, "If You Really Want to Make a Difference in Black Lives, Change How You Teach White Kids." In it, she speaks of the pathology of whiteness, explaining that whiteness is literally a disease that needs to be cured. Her article was so offensive and radical that Megyn Kelly pulled her children from the Upper West Side private school that allegedly circulated the article. In the fall of 2019, the New York City Schools Chancellor, Richard Carranza, held a training for administrators that aimed to end white supremacy culture in schools, a training some parents and administrators called toxic and polarizing. Carranza was later sued by 4 white female administrators for racial discrimination after they were allegedly demoted and replaced simply for being white. In July of this year, the National Museum of African American History and Culture published a pamphlet titled "Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness and White Culture," where white children were taught to confront their whiteness because, according to anti-racist dogma, whiteness is inherently racist, oppressive, and provides unearned privileges to whites at the expense of people of color. In August, the city of Seattle held a training called "Internalized Racial Superiority for White People" for its 10,000 city employees. According to an article in the city paper published by Christopher Rufo, the trainers require white employees to examine their relationships with white supremacy, racism, and whiteness, and explain how their families benefit economically from the system of white supremacy, even as it directly and violently harms black people. Entire academic journals now exist for dismantling so-called whiteness, like the journal Whiteness in Education. An article published in October of 2019 was titled, "Unmasking White Fragility: How Whiteness and White Student Resistance Impacts Anti-Racist Education." Robin DiAngelo, whose book White Fragility has sold millions of copies, says whites must be blunt and actively call out the oppressiveness of whiteness in order to stop systemic racism. To be less white, DiAngelo states, is to be less oppressive racially, to be less arrogant, to be less certain, to be less defensive, to be less ignorant.
So for me to be less white is to be less oppressive racially, to be less arrogant, to be less certain, to be less defensive, to be less ignorant, quite frankly.
Cal Berkeley now offers a course titled Deconstructing Whiteness, which aims to confront conversations about privilege and positionality to understand where white bodies have the responsibility to be in movements against white supremacy and in solidarity with marginalized peoples and groups of color. The class will not coddle white fragility, the course description states, but help students deconstruct and relearn whiteness through case studies, speakers, and critical readings. It's become quite clear that Facebook doesn't want to get in the way of the coordinated vilification of whiteness, white people, and white culture. Facebook still considers statements about men and white people to be in violation of its hate speech policy, and users can still report these statements, but the company's algorithms will no longer automatically flag and delete them, resulting in about 10,000 fewer posts being removed each day, Facebook said. It's good to see that Facebook is living up to its obligations to remain fair and impartial.